Our moderator today is Mr. Tahir Gora. Mr. Gora is a writer, a journalist, and TV host with over 30 years' experience in the industry, including his work as a BBC reporter. He is the founder of Canadian Thinkers Forum and Multicultural Tag TV. Mr. Gora is a strong proponent of social causes and has initiated interfaith and intercultural discussions about contemporary issues. Mr. Gora. Our first panelist is Natasha Fattah. Ms. Fattah is a journalist, documentary host and maker, and has been a producer on the CBC's current affairs show As It Happens. For over 10 years, she has reported about the issues facing minority communities. Currently, Ms. Fattah is a reporter and host at CBC News Network. Our second panelist is Stuart Bell. Mr. Bell is an award-winning Canadian journalist and author. His areas of reporting have included child soldiers in West Africa, the Sri Lankan Civil War, and terrorism in Algeria. He is currently a senior reporter at the National Post newspaper, where he writes about national security issues and foreign affairs. Our third panelist is Ujjal Dosanjh. Mr. Dosanjh is a Canadian lawyer and former politician. As an early advocate for the labor movement in rural Canada, he founded the Canadian Farm Workers Union. He continued his advocacy for social justice as the Attorney General of British Columbia and later as the Premier of British Columbia. His life's work took him to Ottawa, where as the Minister of Health, he was a passionate advocate. And now our moderator, Mr. Gora, will begin the conversation.
Thank you, Ruth Harper and organizers, National Council of Indo-Canadians, for giving us opportunity to speak on a very complex issue. And I welcome my panelists today here on the stage, Natasha Fattah, Stuart Bell, and Honorable Ujjal Dosanjh. Ladies and gentlemen, we are revolving around few fundamental questions such as what is multiculturalism and what is the Canadian version of multiculturalism? And of course, what are Canadian values? What should be Canadian multiculturalism? To address those questions or issues, we are joined with vibrant and visionary Canadians on stage today. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the Department of Canadian Heritage definition, quote, multiculturalism ensures that all citizens can keep their identities, can take pride in their ancestry, and have a sense of belonging, unquote. The Canadian experience has shown that multiculturalism encourages racial and ethnic harmony and cross-cultural understanding and discourages ghettoization, hatred, discrimination, and violence, unquote. In 1971, Canada was the first country in the world to adopt multiculturalism as an official policy. In 1982, multiculturalism was recognized by Section 27 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Canadian Multiculturalism Act was then enacted by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. Until 1982, multiculturalism was not experienced to this extent. The Canadian experience of true multiculturalism has shown its complexities during the past 4 decades. more precisely after 1990s. Let's talk about those complexities. I'll request our first panelist, Natasha Fatah, to reflect on this complex issue. Natasha Fatah.
Before I make my comments, I just want to say what an honor it is to share the stage as theoretically an equal with two men who I've admired for so many years. But nevertheless, I'm here, so let's talk. I think the framework of Canadian multiculturalism is excellent. It's something to be admired. It's something that my family, that we came here for. But I think all these things have to shift in the context of the world that we live in. And today we live in a world where the primary conversation is not about multiculturalism, but it really is about political values. And that's the real question. And it would be dishonest to have the conversation today about Canadian multiculturalism without addressing what just took place once again in London last night, where innocent people doing absolutely nothing wrong, enjoying their freedoms in a modern, secular, democratic country, are mowed down by people who are driven by a hateful, monstrous political ideology. Shame. And I think you can talk about multiculturalism up and down, but that's not the real conversation. We can eat samosas, we can wear shalwar kameez, the dal out there is delicious, but that's not the conversation. The conversation is, do we believe in the equality of individuals? And do you believe fundamentally that a Muslim and a Hindu and a Christian and an atheist and a Buddhist are equal citizens? And that's what real Canadian multiculturalism should mean. And do you believe that a straight person or a gay person or a lesbian or a transgendered or an asexual person are equal? That's what Canadian multiculturalism is all about. So I think, we all go to other countries and we visit our friends and family. Everyone thinks Canada's so soft and sweet and gentle, and we are, and that's great, and I'm proud of that. But I think on these fronts we can be stronger and tougher and have a much more definitive voice in saying multiculturalism goes further to say we absolutely recognize each other as equals regardless of our faith. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but and I have to break the news to you guys if you haven't already heard. A Canadian citizen was killed last night. Our Prime Minister just confirmed that. It is for that Canadian citizen who lost their life that we have to stand up and say, no more. The multiculturalism is really a fight about modern, Western, secular democracy.
Before I moved to Toronto, I worked at the Vancouver Sun. And when I was a young reporter there, I think this would have been 1996, 97. Miguel Assange was the Attorney General, and I had been working on an article. The details escape me. It was something to do with some issue within the BC government under his area, and I had this big scoop on the front page of the paper. And of course, as a young reporter, when you do something like that, you're always paranoid that you completely messed it up, and you're going to get called out. And so I had my scoop on the front page, big scandal, something or other. And Mr. Assange called a news conference to address the issue. And I was panicked. I thought, oh my God. I had this picture in my head of the press conference. Mr. Assange stands up and says, I would like to say that the report in the Vancouver Sun is completely false. The reporter was awful. And all the cameras were turned on me. And so I went to the news conference, and I was so nervous, and to his credit, he said he was launching an investigation into the issues that were raised by my report, and it turned out to be true. But since that day, I've had a new respect for him, because he could have very easily tanked my career right there. I'm sure there's some people who would have been happy if he had. Moving on to the issue here, what I wanted to mention is I think it's becoming clear that we are seeing some strains to multiculturalism right now in this very area, including some of the issues that have come up, the M103 debate, the Peel School debate, in addition to being legitimate topics for civil discussion, have brought forth some very ugly, anti-Muslim, racist type of sentiments that really have no place here. We've seen, we had in the early 90s, late 80s, a very virulent far-right, extremist far-right racist movement. And I recall they would basically, their message was, we don't want the colored people in Canada. They've disappeared to some extent. There's still a little fringe of them that survived. But just in the last 6 months or so, we've seen the rise of a new kind of movement, which is saying very similar things, but it's saying we don't want the Muslim people in Canada. And I think we have to be very cautious about how we frame these debates, that we don't marginalize certain communities, we don't stereotype. And unfortunately, we've seen some of that in debates over these issues. So I think we need to be very cautious. And I think just one last thought about multiculturalism, and the way I look at it, I think, is that to me, what it means is we may all look different, but we want the same things. So there is enough, we're all different, everybody's different, we all have different experiences and come from different places, but there's enough of an overlap of the things that we want in common that we can call ourselves a country and we can move forward on those things. And I think that's what we're trying to define. What are those things? What is the Canada we want? And are we really going in that direction?
I can't really talk about multiculturalism in Canada without really thinking about the world. I don't think we're an island unto ourselves. Multiculturalism has its problems and has its good sides and not so good sides. But if what's happening in the world today, there's a march towards desecularizing spaces that have been secular for a long, long time, and it's all over the world. It's in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, like Hungary. UKIP was part of it in the Brexit movement. That was partly xenophobic. What Trump is doing in the name of the Muslim ban, and the Tea Party before him, it sprang from sort of the right-wing xenophobic elements in the US. When Obama got elected, the first thing the Tea Party said, they had never said that before with the election of any president in the history of the United States of America. As soon as Obama got elected, I don't know whether you remember, they said, we want our country back, as if Obama had taken the country away to some other place. So Turkey is on its march back to sort of the ascendance of religion in its affairs. Turkey, that was so secular for such a long time. So this is not something that's happening in London. It's happening all over the world. In India, we see a march towards more religion in the domain of politics. Religion is all over India. People are intensely religious in India. But I grew up in India and I go back to India. I have never seen the ascendance and the influence of religion in politics so much as I've seen now. And that what that does is that divides us. It doesn't unite us. What secularism, what secular spaces said to us a long time ago, when I was growing up, you can be who you are, you can worship the way you want, but in the secular spaces, in the public square, when we have debates and discussions, we're all the same, we're all equal. And I think that with the kind of violence that's been going on, it has an impact on multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is not just about how we live in Canada. The world is so intertwined now, so small now, increasingly small, that we can't talk about our own multiculturalism without talking about the rest of the world. The rest of the world has an impact on us. We have an impact on the rest of the world. We are not, we're not immune to these problems. We have had our Toronto 18. We've had our people being killed. We had secular atheist terrorism back in the 90s in British Columbia with BC Hydro bomb blast, if you remember, Stuart. You're too young to remember that, probably. So we've had a sort of religion-based terrorism, religion-tinged terrorism, and secular terrorism. So, but we, right now, I believe the only way we can come together is if we start talking about shared values across the world. We can celebrate our differences, but we will not be a peaceful world, a better world, unless we start talking about the shared values. You can't be who you are if you're a violent person, I'm sorry. We can't say to someone coming to this country or someone in this country already for generations or for 10 years, you can be who you are, you can mutilate female genitalia, it's all right. It's not all right. So, it's not free for all. Multiculturalism doesn't mean, shouldn't mean you can do whatever you want. Let's talk about shared values and then celebrate our differences. It's those shared values that are going to create a socially, culturally cohesive and peaceful world. Thank you.
Thank you, dear panelists, for your first round. And I think Natasha and myself are in better position to call spade a spade, what's going to happen within our own community. Actually, in our debate so far, what I discovered, we are mixing again religion with the cultures. Culture is way bigger entity than religion. Religion, in my humble opinion, is a very small part of culture. For instance, I can explain my point of view. As a Punjabi, I would share my cultural heritage with Punjabi Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, so much. We have so much common. And on the other hand, when I'll sit with an Arab Muslim fellow, he would ask me, brother, how are you? And I would respond, brother, how are you? And our conversation is done. And when we Punjabis sit together, no matter what religion we belong to, we can talk for days and days. So the complex issue in terms of multiculturalism, what I see when our politicians, policymakers start mixing religions with cultures. They don't see Punjabi as one entity, as I'm Punjabi Muslim and Punjabi Hindu, Punjabi Sikh, Punjabi Christian. They divide us on the basis of religious lines. So I'll ask Natasha to shed more light on this.
Like the elephant in the room is the issue of Islamism. What pushed Brexit forward, what pushed Trump forward is the issue of dealing with Islamism. Now, we might have differing perspectives on whether it's a Muslim ban or it's the necessary tactic to keep jihadis out of the United States, and all of that discussion is worth having. But I think a real failure in the conversation has been the lack of critical analysis about what's going on in Muslim communities. And it's very, very important, as I mentioned, that we address that it's various communities, and I have this discussion on almost on a weekly basis in the newsroom because they say Muslim community reacts. Muslim community reacts. Well, who the heck are you guys talking about? I'm sorry, you're talking about the Somali community? Are you talking about the Bosnians? Are you talking about Chechens? Are you talking about Uyghurs? You're talking about Kashmiris? You're talking about Sindhis, Gujaratis? Who are you talking about? And so this notion as though the Muslim community is one monolith and then everyone feels the exact same way has been a major disservice. And I think part of the reason what Ujjwal sir brought up is such a good point about this pushback, this sort of right-wing, angry, anti-immigrant pushback is a direct response to what I think honest, decent people feel, and what they tell us as reporters on a regular basis is that politicians aren't being honest. There's clearly a problem with the jihadism, there's clearly a problem with religious extremism, and they won't address it, and they're not taking it seriously, and they keep going to the mosques, and they keep going to the mandars, and they keep going to the temples, and they're placating, and they're not taking it seriously. So, well, in the vacuum of an honest discussion, it's the extremists that always fill the gap, and that's what happens again and again. When most Muslims who are law-abiding and decent and peaceful and secular don't speak, because guess what? They have 9-to-5 jobs like everybody else. They don't have time to say, no, that we've got a problem in the community, we've got a problem in our mosques. They're scared to say it. So who fills the gap? The guy that represents the mosque and the guy who represents some really right-wing racist group, because they've got the time to fill that gap. So I think it's not just a matter of mixing up culture and community, but it's like, and religion. We're not going deep enough into the thing. Something is clearly wrong, but the fear of appearing racist or Islamophobic or getting that pushback is so deep-rooted in our decency as Canadians, because we are so proud of being multicultural, that it doesn't allow us to have that very uncomfortable conversation. So Theresa May says today, we've been too tolerant of extremism, and we need to have the uncomfortable conversation, and I would suggest that perhaps something like that needs to happen in Canada as well.
Having monitored and reported on extremism and terrorism for a couple of decades now, and Ijal knows all about this as well, we have to remember that extremism in Canada anyway, and around the world, it takes on different coats from year to year to year. In the 80s, we had Sikh extremists who were behind the Air India attack. There's been waves of different types of extremism. The problem is not, in my mind, any particular religion. The problem is extremism. Extremism exists, in my experience, in pretty much every community where you choose to look. And related to that is, I think, there was a philosopher, Karl Popper. He wrote on this concept that you have to be in an open society like ours, you have to be careful that you do not tolerate intolerance, because tolerating intolerance leads inevitably to the end of tolerance. It's kind of a philosophical mind game when you think about it. That would be my take on this. I think, there was a French writer who put this quite well, I think, that what we're experiencing right now is not necessarily the radicalization of Islam. It's the Islamization of radicalism. Throughout any generation, just simply go back in Canada, there have always been extremists of some type that have come forth and committed types of violence, going back to the Doukhobors in British Columbia, a century ago. Today, it just happens to be that the primary threat that we're seeing, the people that are engaging in it are wearing this cloak. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, to what extent do they represent that, and to what extent are they simply violent people who are wrapping themselves in an ideology to justify doing things for other reasons? I think it's probably a bit of both.
I agree, but I want to take the conversation back to who we are to begin with. Tahir, you talked about politicians treating us as Sikhs and Christians and Hindus and Muslims rather than treating us as Canadians or Punjabis or Indians or wherever we come from. Yes, all the politicians, most of the politicians are actually guilty of that. But we are guiltier of that, many of us. And that is because when we come from the lands where we were, there we were Indians first. When I was in India, I was an Indian first. Many of the people who will tell you they're Sikh Canadians, they used to be Indians first too. But when we come to this country, then we become Sikhs or Hindus or Muslims or whatever, rather than being Indians or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. We actually diminish, dilute, and mutilate our own identity that we brought with us. And politicians just play into that. It's the easiest thing to pander to religion and get people together. If we pander ourselves, we make it easier for politicians to pander to these things. If you have motions on certain things in the legislature in Ontario or Parliament in Canada, which talks about religion, doesn't talk about the problems, doesn't talk about who we are as a people, but separates us and then panders to us based on our religion or our perceived real or imagined grievances, then we are actually creating a problem for ourselves. And thank you. So as Mr. Harper said, when he went to India, they asked him about the Khalistanis, and he said, well, it's a free country, right? To his credit, he never associated with the Khalistanis. In the case of Mr. Trudeau, having some pictures been taken recently at a parade, he faces the same problem, but he is guilty of participating in it. So his liberation or freedom, emancipation doesn't come from simply saying it's a free country. I would say to him, it's a free country, they can parade, you can dissociate yourself from it. So as politicians we're guilty, as human beings, we ghettoize ourselves into our little religious pigeonholes, we are guilty as well.
As multicultural societies, are we multicultural communities integrated well as one unit, or we are segregated? Or we are segregating ourselves, in fact, I should say. So in that kind of environment, is multiculturalism one-way traffic? I'll cite an example. A couple of years ago, McMaster University invited me, and they were celebrating Hijab Day. And I told the professor, it's a beautiful gesture that white Canadian girls are wearing hijab to show their solidarity with Muslim girls. But I will ask my Muslim sisters to wear Western dress next day to show their solidarity with the Western communities. Because multiculturalism is not one-way traffic. It's a give and take. And it's a bouquet. It's not like that a rose is there and sunflower is there. So that's what the perception of policymakers and politicians and even media in our country, we see that they think that these ghettos are good. This is multiculturalism. I don't call it multiculturalism, I call it a uniculturalism. So how to reflect on this complex issue?
You know, I have long believed multiculturalism is a double-edged sword. And in fact, the politicians in this country have allowed the benefits of both edges of that sword to the communities who want to ghettoize themselves. For instance, if somebody criticizes a particular ethnic minority or religious minority for doing something, the minority can say, you guys don't understand us, this is our culture, this is our religion, so we should be free to. So, but the politicians on the other hand, if they don't have the courage to address the issue, go into it and say, hey, this is not acceptable, at least in this country. Politicians who are afraid of doing that, they say, oh, we don't understand that, it's their culture. So we actually ghettoize each other in the way we treat each other. Politicians, many of them are cowards. They don't address these issues. They shy away. They run away from these issues. And the difficulty that we have is that, you know, ghettos are not recent. We've had ghettos as long as we have had civilization. Ghettos happen when people are either poorer, have less means. You have poor ghettos. You have religious ghettos. You have ethnic ghettos. That is basically because people, by nature, would love to go and live where they feel comfortable, where they have people who speak like them, act like them, understand them more easily. You know, I'm fond of saying, when we first started talking about these issues back in the 70s on radio talk shows and started arguing about these issues, I remembered saying to someone, you know, there is a place in West Vancouver called the British Properties. And I said to the guys, I said, well, if the Indians come and they live in Southeast Vancouver, or they come to Surrey, Punjabis live in Surrey mainly, you know, people rich and white who used to come from Britain and the rest of Europe who used to go live in the British properties. So we understand why we do that. The effort is, how do we get beyond those boundaries that we build around ourselves? And that has to happen with each Canadian citizen being fully engaged, saying, you know, I'm going to get out of my so-called comfort zone or my ghetto, and I'm going to go learn about what the next person is doing. And that is hard to do when people are working 9 to 5 or 12-hour shifts, looking after 2 or 3 children, school going, and they don't have the means, and you're working double shifts. So I can understand it, but I actually blame more the politicians than anybody else, because they don't talk about these issues. They don't tell you. They'll come to a Punjabi thing, or they'll go to a Hellenic center for the Greeks, and they'll go to the, the Ukrainian place. They'll wear their garb and dress and speak a few words of their language, and they think they've done their job for multiculturalism. I'm sorry, that's not good enough. You have to urge people. You have to urge people to have shared values. You can have different way of worshiping God if God. Nobody has any problems with that. But we should have shared values in the public square, in our neighborhoods where we live with each other. And there is very little emphasis politicians place in their public utterances about shared values. They continue to say this foolish phrase, which is empty and devoid of anything: diversity is strength. Well, diversity is not strength unless we do it right, and we aren't doing it right now. That's my belief.
As a Canadian, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. I respect whatever belief system you may have, wherever you come from, but really it doesn't matter. What matters is, to me, and how I judge people, to the extent that I do, is, how good a Canadian are you? And it comes down to some degree to this, sort of rights versus responsibilities type of give and take question, that we all live within those two pressures. And my family came here from another country, and they devoted their lives to repaying that country for the rest of their lives, for the gift that they were given of having a second chance to start a life here. That's the way I see it. We're so lucky to have an opportunity to live in a place like this, and we owe every day to make that place a better country. And sometimes and this often appears in the news, we see people that are very focused on their own rights, and yet seem to be completely oblivious to the responsibilities they owe to Canada for what it's given them. And so maybe that's where this question comes down to, in terms of the give and take of multiculturalism.
It's the multiculturalism. It's a false narrative. We've decided as Canadians to adopt that as a part of our identity. But, I was born in Pakistan, and Karachi was very multicultural. There was lots of different ethnic communities, at least in the 80s. They've bullied everybody the hell out of there now, but whatever. You did have a Christian community, you had a Parsi community, you had Hindus, and you had a handful of Sikhs, and you had a very diverse political sets of communities as well. And I grew up in Saudi Arabia, which has a different kind of multiculturalism. Like, we had a huge South Asian community in Jeddah, and we had a huge Filipino community and lots of Americans there. So I've experienced multiculturalism, and having been lucky enough to live in the Netherlands and Mexico, and in Mexico seeing all these different communities of Spanish speakers and all that. But it really does get down to what Ujjal was saying. It's not about the multiculturalism, it's just sort of, that's nice, that's your private business. It really does come down to the shared values. What do you value? And then I think it comes down to that issue of tolerance. So while Karachi might have been multicultural and Jeddah might have been multicultural, they weren't particularly tolerant. And we are tolerant, and it's something that gets lost in it. We as a country have decided to be open and gracious and welcoming, and we're open. And that leads into what Stuart is talking about, a having a degree of gratitude. It's, you know, when we come here as newcomers to this country, I couldn't agree more with your family sentiment of like, we owe this country something. You know, it's that JFK stance of ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Like, this country has given us everything. We're in this beautiful space, we're breathing clean air, we live in great safety compared to most places in the world. Those are Canadian values. Men and women are sitting together. Every different faith, I would argue, is sitting together in this room. That is the beauty of being a Canadian. That is whatever the multiculturalism is, doesn't matter. Those are the shared values of decency and democracy and dignity that really matter. So, I mean, they can do the hijab day if they want, but that's not what makes you Canadian, and that's not the thing to be proud of. The thing to be proud of is that women in those class are equal to the boys in the class.
Ladies and gentlemen, our talk is about multiculturalism. Is it integration or segregation? And since the very first day I arrived here in Canada in 1999, I'm hearing two phrases: Canadian experience and Canadian values. And my Canadian experience of Canadian values so far is that we are caught up in political correctness. And in that context, recently when MP Kelly Leach, politically though, raised this issue, and I was talking to her the other day, and I told her that my Canadian value is to believe in one law, to believe in gender equality, to believe in democracy, to believe in freedom, individuality, individual freedom, and if a person wears hijab, if a person has turban, if a person has long beard, if a person wears Arabic dress, I have no issue as long as they believe in those fundamental core values. I don't even call those core values as Canadian values. I take them as universal human values. So that is my personal take about Canadian values. But my personal Canadian experience of Canadian value is little different. So how would you reflect on those? Who would like to begin on this sensitive issue?
Well, you know, I'm reminded, Tariq, of something that I learned when I came to Canada in 1968. I was in England for 3.5 years, and I was 18 years old when I came from India to England in the first place. I came to Canada, to Vancouver, British Columbia, to a very small Indian community. Very few Pakistanis, very few Indians, very few South Asians. I think the total South Asian population of British Columbia at that time was less than 50,000 when I came to Canada. So the 15 or 20,000 or 30,000 that lived in Greater Vancouver were absolutely extremely integrated. They were integrated not just in terms of dress or whatever, they were integrated in terms of values, which was a lot more important for me. When this multiculturalism thing began and it started with song and dance. It came to values much later. I had experiences all the way, and I could write a book on that, but you don't want to hear all of those. But I said to people who first started telling us that multiculturalism is about your culture, about your dress, and about your dance, and you can keep it. I used to say to them, when I came to Canada, Indians had been here and Pakistanis had been here for over 100 years, close to 100 years. And they had maintained certain cultural values like looking after their elders, living with them, caring for them, in joint families as much as they could. I said nobody needed any grants for that. Nobody needed anything for that. So we don't need your multiculturalism to do that. I want multiculturalism to be about equality, about democracy, about freedom of the individual. And one of them, I was on a committee, one of them said, no, equality and that kind of stuff, that's like more controversial. Let's talk about celebrating our differences. And so I said to him, you mean multiculturalism minus equality means peace, and we should have peace rather than equality, right? And so we went through those phases earlier on multiculturalism in this country. And so, multiculturalism for me is just a phrase. Each one of us can believe what it is. And the second thing I'm reminded of is my friend Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister's comments. And I was struck, and I disagreed with him on this. His comments to the Vogue magazine some months ago were that Canada has no mainstream, talking about shared values. Canada has no mainstream, we have many streams, but we have shared values. So I kept wondering, if we don't have one mainstream, where do we share the values? Where are the intersections of the communities and values? Where do we come together? I mean, those are the kinds of non sequiturs, meaningless statements that actually make multiculturalism meaningless. That's why we have questions about multiculturalism, because our leaders, our political leaders, don't actually seriously understand that the Canada we're building is not, in the name of multiculturalism, is not the Canada that I dreamt of when I came to this country, where you share the values, where you are part of the mainstream, not in color, because I can't change my color, nor would I want to, not in my skin color, not maybe in the way I might dance, not by my mother tongue, not by the dress I might wear, but by the values I cherish about equality, diversity, individual freedom, democracy, and all of those things. And if we have no mainstream, if our definition of multiculturalism is that Canada really doesn't have a mainstream, then we don't have shared values. And that's actually the crisis of Canada.
The Prime Minister said, which was that Canada was a post-national state, which I don't even quite understand. I'm not sure he does. But again, I think it comes down to this question of what is the common ground? What are the things that we all believe in? And to some extent, just erase everything else, all the superficial things that are only on the surface of people. Really we live in a kind of social contract, right? I want freedom, so I give you freedom. I accept limits on my behavior because I don't want your behavior to interfere with me. I will not steal because I do not want to be stolen from. These are basic limits that we accept. In the same way, and this is surprisingly difficult question in some places today, I want to be tolerated, and therefore I tolerate. And so, again, we're coming back to, we seem to be struggling with that question of where is the overlap of all the different streams, where do they intersect, and how can we grab onto that and define it, really. And it's amazing that we don't really have kind of visionary political leaders in our country. We haven't for some time. They seem to avoid that question. Maybe it must be politically difficult to do, I don't know. But we need to be constantly reminding ourselves of what is that common ground, what is that shared area, and emphasizing it so that we don't drift into this sort of fiction of thinking that we aren't a real country, we're a post-national country. We don't have a mainstream. It's not true.
I want to share an experience I had during election week in New York City. So my husband and I went to New York City, not for work, just for fun, because we thought, what the heck, like Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, it's Clash of the Titans, like we have to go see this history unfold. And Donald Trump won, and the world is shocked. And trust me, every New Yorker was shocked because New York did not vote for Donald Trump. And so all these protests started popping up all over the city. Our vacation got completely derailed, but it didn't matter because it was really fun and interesting to witness this thing happen. And then I noticed something really bizarre because we kept going to university campuses because that's where so many of the protests were taking place. And so there was this long line for the mic, and one after another, student would go up and say why they oppose Donald Trump and why Donald Trump is not their president. So one person would stand up and say, I'm a lesbian and I didn't vote for Donald Trump, and then walk off. I'm a refugee. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I'm a Muslim. I'm gay. I'm this, I'm that. And I thought, okay, but nobody talked about what they're studying. No one talked about their part-time job, their full-time job, what their dreams are, what their aspirations are, what they actually believe in, what they value. And I just thought, oh, this must be just some sort of pushback to what Trump represented. But then subsequently, I've gone to a few university events, non-political events here in Canada, and I'm noticing the same thing happening. And this is just a very personal observation that I find troubling, that so many young people are categorizing themselves by things they don't choose. So I didn't choose to be Muslim, and I didn't choose to be a woman, I didn't choose to be straight, and I didn't choose to be born in Pakistan, and I didn't choose to have brown skin, and I don't want those things to define me. Like, that's what I think the problem is with multiculturalism. The fact that I put myself through school, the fact that English is not my first language, and I work at the Canadian broadcaster, the public broadcaster, that the fact that I had I think the fortitude to push back and say, I don't want to marry a Muslim, I'm going to marry the man I actually love who's not a Muslim. Like, those things that I chose for myself, or the things I accomplished for myself, or the things that I believe in, that's what I want individuals to be defined by. But I think there's a problem now with what is happening in multiculturalism and what's being celebrated in it, is that you're being celebrated for things you don't choose and you don't have anything to do with. And while that would have been okay a short while ago, recently I find it's turned really ugly and mean, and you see these protests, at least in downtown Toronto, almost on a weekly basis, with young students pushing back against what they describe as the fascism of the right wing. But they're just primarily defining themselves by things that they haven't accomplished. And maybe I'm alone in this, but I really think that that's problematic, and that could be the seed of something that's going to be a problem in 1 or 2 generations, where your achievements don't define you, but the color of your skin does. I thought that was the whole thing we were trying to push against with anti-racism, is that your color and your religion don't define you. It's your integrity and your value as an individual. I think the individual liberty should be lost in all of this.
I would like to share a concern or question from my Didi, my sister Aruna Pap. She always says that unfortunately this superficial prevailing multicultural model has damaged ethnic women's situation in Canada.
Again, I can only share personal observations. As a woman and as a person of color, and I do think there's some truth to that, just anecdotally from what I witnessed, that women, let's make it very specific, like secular Muslim women, like the women in my family, in my immediate circle, who culturally associate as being Muslim. We look forward to Eid, they might fast for Ramadan, but it's our private business and we don't need to have anybody convert or inflict it on anybody else, it's our business. But they feel like you're not Muslim enough. Like, what defines you as a Muslim for the mainstream or under the guise of multiculturalism has to be something very cartoonish. Like, I have to literally wear my religion on my head. I have to speak in Arabic, which is a language I don't speak. Like, I have to become a very, very small, narrow definition, somebody else's definition of what it means to become a Muslim. Because that goes back to the other issue of like the Muslim community. Well, the mainstream society has decided that this is what a Muslim woman looks like, and this is what she thinks, and this is how she talks, and that's how we're going to define her. And if any one of us doesn't fall into one of those parameters, then we're not Muslim enough. And I think a lot of women of color and from a lot of ethnic and religious minorities get frustrated with that.
I'm talking about I've been talking about this center in Canada of shared things without really explaining what it is. So I'm going to give it a try. And I don't know about the term multiculturalism. I'm not really sure what it is. I think diversity is a word that I think I can understand. In nature, diversity is a strength. In society also. The diversity of Canada is amazing. It's fantastic. And I guess the question is, can we be a country where anyone from anywhere can come, leave behind whatever mess they're leaving behind, and there are a lot of messy places around the world that people want to leave behind, and to live in Canada as a Canadian, to live according to principles of equality and pluralism and diversity and tolerance. Can we do that? And I think that's the big Canadian question. So I felt like I've been speaking about something without defining it, and so I wanted to go a little bit there, and I'd love to hear your ideas also about what is the center. But what is it? What Canada do we want, and are we going that way?
Multiculturalism, while I think many of us may have felt was liberating, was more inclusive, was good for minorities, it had its downsides. One of the downsides it had for a long, long time was that multiculturalism appeared to be just for people of color, as if whites had just fallen from the sky, had no ethnicities and no culture. You know, politicians only talk about multiculturalism when they're visiting you and I. They don't talk about multiculturalism when they go to the Chamber of Commerce and they go to great meetings. That's the great tragedy of multiculturalism. In fact, it became a divisive factor in the way politicians looked at it. Multiculturalism was for me, and the rest of it was for the white politician. And I think that that's very destructive to the social cohesion that we're seeking through multiculturalism. The other negative part of multiculturalism, inadvertent perhaps, was that we began to stress, Natasha's point, we began to stress our exclusive identities. We became brown or less brown, or men or women, or gay and lesbians, or whatever else we came from, rather than becoming Canadians under the rubric, all-inclusive rubric it was supposed to be, of multiculturalism. And I think in that sense, multiculturalism has been very destructive to the soul of Canada and to the soul of many other countries.
Thank you very much, dear panelists, for setting the tone for our discussion today. And on behalf of National Council of Indo-Canadians, I am very much thankful for the team, particularly Ruth Harper, Sudhir Handa, Gurdev Maan, Vijay Sapani, Balaraj Deo, Shah Ibrahim, and all of you, and very grateful for your participation.
#1 Multicultural Channel. This is TAG TV.